All right. I want to talk about an issue that I think we've all been thinking about lately, which is what's the best way to model meaning? Metaphorically, people, it's a conundrum in terms of once you understand that meaning is primarily composed of metaphor, and you start talking about metaphor, you then are thrown into the problem of speaking metaphorically about metaphor. And what's been settled on somewhat is the idea of talking about metaphors as if they're frames, right? And so you hear talk about reframing issues, or, try this frame, let's look at this frame. And this, I don't think this is the ideal one. And I'll try to explain why. I think the ideal is to think about metaphors as if they're waves of probability. So for instance, in the Me Too movement, when that began, there were some articles. There was one famous one by some French women who kind of wrote a letter, and they described the Me Too movement as if it was a witch hunt, right? And this really bothered people because what did they mean by that? There's lots of different attributes to a witch hunt. And so when you compare two things, the Me Too movement to a witch hunt, what are the attributes that are activated? Well, it's ambiguous, or it can be ambiguous if it doesn't have the proper context. So one of the aspects of witch hunts is that witches aren't real. Another aspect of witch hunts is that there is a public hysteria that develops. And then that witches are also punished. And people who are very sympathetic to this particular power dynamic that women had found themselves in relationship to their bosses, and their bosses taking advantage of it, they looked at this statement, and the attribute that was highlighted for them was that witches aren't real, right? And that what these people are essentially saying is that the anxiety and the indignation over this particular problem were also then based off of a false premise. But I think what the letter was actually saying is that they thought that the reaction was going too far, right? Going too far, of course, is another metaphor where you have a movement, right? And a movement is moving in a direction, and there is a set goal it's trying to reach to, and it can hit that point accurately, it can undershoot it, and it can overshoot it. So it can go too far, it can't go far enough, it goes just far enough, right? So when we speak metaphorically, we are essentially speaking with a degree of ambiguity, because it's usually not clear which of the attributes, I don't know if it's usually not clear, but there is some ambiguity over which attributes we are wanting to highlight within the set of logical entailments that come with the metaphor that we're using. And so this is what I think is best modeled by a wave of probability. Right? So there's this wave of possible meanings that when you speak crashes over somebody. And you're not sure which tail of probability is activated in the person. And it's really only through this kind of constant dialogue that you can sort it out. And it's also possible that the person speaking doesn't know or hasn't resolved it yet in their mind. And so giving yourself the ambiguity basically gives you some wiggle room, right? It's like somebody could say, oh, this is a witch hunt. And then somebody might say, well, what do you mean by that? And they might respond, like, do you think this is false? These allegations are all false? And they would say, well, no. Right? And so in real time, the meaning of what they say has room to change within the metaphorical structure. And there are these areas of wiggle room that ambiguity gives us in meaning that are both exciting and interesting, but also can be used as weapons, right? It can be weaponized to realize that maybe you've said something incorrect or said something that has not necessarily you think is incorrect, but has caused anxiety in the other person and caused conflict, and you kind of want to wiggle out of the conflict. And so in that brief exchange, you choose the path of least resistance, which that metaphor gives you access to. So if you'd want to model, I think about this because this kind of all comes from the fact that I'm an artist, and I've thought a lot about, ways we can objectively talk about meaning, right? Because pretty much today in the art world, it's assumed that you can say nothing objectively about meaning, that everything is kind of skewed by this cultural historical perspective, and that and there's nothing really objectively true that you could say about artwork or meaning in general. And I just really that really bothered me because I didn't believe it. I didn't believe that was true. I do think context is incredibly important and shapes a lot of how we think about the world. But that doesn't necessarily mean we can't objectively talk about meaning itself, which is why I was very attracted to conceptual metaphor theory, ideas where you can objectively talk about meaning, right? So it's like, are you grasping what I'm saying? Like, it's objectively true that saying that is a result of us having hands and being able to grasp things in the world like objects. And that we have linked those two domains of having hands and being able to grasp things and drop things and throw things with ideas, the world of ideas, understanding ideas. I grasp this idea, I understand it, I hold it, I have control over it, therefore I know it. And so if you think about how you could model the kind of an interchange of meaning between two people, And partially I think this would be interesting to people studying artificial intelligence, where they're, like they try to have robots have conversations, and it's always kind of like somewhat like a conversation, but mostly kind of random nonsense. But we enjoy the random nonsense when it's enough like a conversation that it just seems silly and not just total word salad. I think it could be possible to be able to model human meaning by having these metaphorical waves of probability that have more likely outcomes in terms of what are the attributes that are intended. Right? You can talk about crime as if it's a wild animal. Crime is out of control. It's ravaging our city. It's lurking. All these ways that we talk about in terms of wild animals. But there's all sorts of attributes and logical entailments of relating crime to wild animals that aren't nearly as probabilistic, such as like, how do wild animals reproduce? Or what color's their fur, right? It's like, these are like the probabilities of those trails are less than, 0.01%. Whereas the probability that people are linking ideas of crime and animals to things like ferociousness and danger and the ability to cause harm, all of those things are way up there on the list, right? And you could do this to all metaphorical categories at some point. And of course, the hard part about this is that language is changing. And so you could do a thorough study of how people mean and intend things today, and that, is going to inevitably change once you're done with the study. It would be slightly different. It wouldn't be completely different, because again, what I think is grounding in this particular way of thinking about meaning is that, we talk about heat and desire as if they are linked together, right? So people are described as hot. We describe ourselves as getting hot. There's all sorts of slang that revolves around fire. And while the slang changes on a surface level, it still eventually points back to the ultimate metaphorical truth that I shouldn't call it truth, but it points back to the metaphor of fire and heat, right? Like the new slang of things being lit, right? It's not talking about desire, but it is, again, just this play on fire and all the different attributes of fire. And we're not going to start associating coldness with affection and sex and fire in a way that's desirable, right? That's never going to happen, because our bodies are not going to give us that experience. We're not going to get colder when we embrace someone and have that be a pleasurable experience, right? So we talk about people being cold as a negative, right? It's like you could, you can embrace someone and be like, oh, they were so cold. That's always going to be a negative. Because culture and history can't really touch that fundamental dynamic of being a body. It can shape all sorts of other things. It can shape, what behaviors we view as hot. It can shape, what styles we consider hot, or what certain bodies or, fashion. But it can't touch the fundamental metaphor. So that's the really powerful thing to me. And when I was writing about artwork, I wanted to start writing about it in a way that I could use the power of this particular probabilistic wave that I learned about. Because I feel like there is a real crisis within art criticism and art reviews of the death of the expert, the death of anyone being able to objectively say something is good or bad. And also, just the decline of trust in institutions, art institutions, that they can even make this judgment. And then what you have is essentially, well, what can you then? Well, then you can describe the work. You can tell a story about your personal experience looking at the work. And those are things that are done, and they're usually deeply unsatisfying to me. And then what's kind of really took hold is the, looking at artwork from this very particular social, historical justice angle, where this language of academia has been applied. And it was almost like, well, we can't say anything objectively true about this, so let's at least do some good, or what we view as good in the world, by, trying to give marginalized communities a greater voice. But that's really, I don't want to get into that whole thing, but to me, that's sidestepping the issue, right? It's saying that again, it's just saying we've given up on the idea that we can talk about any sort of objective truth in relationship to artwork and what it means, and we're just going to go with, which may be totally reasonable, your particular political goals that you want to achieve. I understand the pragmatic reasoning there. So what does this sound like? This sounds like, what is an example of this applied to artwork? It goes something like this. You look at a piece of work, and there is something, I guess this really brings up the multimodal nature of metaphor, which is that metaphor is not embedded in language. Metaphor is multimodal. It's in language, it's in our body, it's visual, it's all over the place. It's in our body in the sense that we perform all of these hand gestures and have this performance we do with our body while we're speaking. And while some of the hand gestures seem to be non-metaphorical, where you're just kind of like moving your hands in a way that might just help you process and think through something, or just are nervous and wanting to do something with your hands, there are other hand gestures that are highlighting aspects in all these logical entailments of what you're talking about in ways that isn't being highlighted in your speech. So it's like simultaneously you are describing two different metaphorical attributes and really not being aware of either one of them sometimes, which is kind of amazing to think about. So with visual work, when you look at visual work, a lot of it, it's very easy for it to hit upon one of these kind of central base objective metaphors. Almost like, they're almost like archetypes, right? They're, like if I had to think of like a metaphorical archetype off the top of my head that would be good to relate to artwork, like something like balance, right? Balance is almost always conceived of as good, right? Because again, we're a body. Most of the time, we're not falling on our face. Like, it's good to keep your balance. It's bad when you lose your balance because you fall and you hurt yourself. Balance is good. That's why when we talk about balancing social and work, or balancing having kids and your own personal time, the fundamental idea in those constructs is that balance is good. Like, you want to achieve balance. And that, that is this kind of like metaphorical archetype that you can see in a lot of artwork, and that certain pieces can then extrapolate off of that idea or offer kind of a novel interpretation. It can go down one of the logical entailment pathways that nobody's ever gone down before. Relate things that have previously been unrelated. And when they do that, one of the things that they do is they bring into focus the fact that this thing that you did not even conceive of as a metaphor is a metaphor. Right? You confuse the normal understanding with kind of a novel understanding. And you are then in that moment able to make somebody see the structure of meaning. So that's what I was trying to do when I was writing about artwork. I would find one of these metaphorical archetypes and then talk about just what that piece made me think about in relationship to it. And I think this is a really good way to talk about artwork that doesn't descend into subjective judgment, or description, or just an endless amount of social historical context trying to place it in a particular, landscape of events. So yeah, that's I think that's all I got.